Hey friends, welcome to Whiskey and Literature. I'm your host, Captain Mike, and I'm excited about this video tonight because I'm comparing my favorite fantasy series with two other greats. It's an epic fantasy showdown. The Game of Thrones versus The Wheel of Time versus Sword of Truth. And these aren't quite the OG of fantasy. That would be Lord of the Rings. These are more like second gen fantasy series. And I have had a love of fantasy since I started reading, first with Lord of the Rings and the Dragonlance Chronicles, then on to Shannara and the Belgariad. I discovered The Wheel of Time in the mid-90s, followed shortly by The Sword of Truth and Game of Thrones. We're only going to talk about the first book in each series tonight. I think first books are like the front door to your house. It's the entryway. It lets you know what's coming. You can learn a lot about a series from the first book, and indeed, the first line. I read all three of these books in the past 2 weeks, and it was great to experience them again. I am jealous of those of you who get to read these books for the first time, though I am a big fan of the reread. And on that note, let me know, have you read these books? What are your thoughts on them? Leave a comment below. Or at the very least, who is your favorite fantasy author, or what is your favorite fantasy series? And tonight is not going to be, in any respect, a complete review of these books. It's more of just my thoughts on the books and a recommendation. I will also give my thoughts on the entire series and on the TV series. And be advised, this is not a spoiler-free review tonight or channel. And I did realize as I was reading these and scripting tonight's review that I should have just picked two books and just done a head-to-head. I oftentimes bite off more than I can chew. But having said that, let's get it. And we're gonna go in order that these books were released. First up, The Wheel of Time. And its first book, The Eye of the World, was published in 1990. The author, Robert Jordan, initially expected to do 6 books, and it turned out to be 14 books long. He passed away in 2007, and the last 3 books were penned by fantasy author Brandon Sanderson. Jordan left copious notes aiding Sanderson's task, and the last book was published in 2013. The first book is, of course, The Eye of the World, and this is a book that I have read numerous, like more than a dozen times. There were 3 or 4 books in this series when I started reading, and each time a new book would come out, I would read the entire series over again, and then occasionally I would just burn through the entire series for the fun of it. Paperback, hardback, Kindle, Audible, and graphic novels. If the first book is a peek into the series, the first chapter, or in this case, prologue, is a peek into the book. We are immediately confused, and it's not until much later in the book we even know what the heck was the meaning of the prologue. On to chapter 1. I love the first chapter of The Wheel of Time. We are introduced to the youth Rand and his father Tam as they are journeying along the quarry road, taking their brandy and cider to Emmons Field for the Beltane Festival. The cold, the wind, the stranger whose black cloak doesn't move in the wind. Matt, everyone's favorite rascal. And then in the second chapter, we meet Perrin, the third of the Emmons Fields boys. We don't get a lot of backstory or explanation. Instead, the story unfolds in a slow, deliberate pace. We meet the Emmons Field Five, and almost the entire story is told from their perspectives, only occasionally deviating from that to kind of flesh out the rest of the story. We can slide this into the epic high fantasy category. It's epic because the scope of the world and the fate of the world hinges on the actions of the characters. It's great that we start in this small village and we really get to know the central characters before they are forced to leave. And then we get to see quite a bit of the world outside, even in just this first volume. High fantasy because of the magic system, and I do love the magic in this series. Central to the theme is that the Wheel of Time turns and weaves the pattern of existence using human lives as threads. Those who have the ability or whose actions can change the weave are called Taviran, and of course the Emmonsfield 3 are Taviran. The Wheel of Time is turned by the One Power, half of which is channeled by men called Sidene, and the other half by women called Sidar. Sidene was tainted by the Dark One when he was imprisoned thousands of years ago, so that any man that channels will go mad. The Wheel of Time turns, ages come and go. The seal on the Dark One's prison is weakening, allowing him to exert influence on the world, and the chosen who were imprisoned with him are free. Has the dragon been reborn? And can he learn and grow enough to become strong enough to stop the Dark One from breaking time itself? The Aes Sedai Moraine doesn't know which of those three boys is the dragon reborn, if one of them is. So she just takes all three of them to the Eye of the World. As they journey from Emmonsfield to the Eye of the World, that's the entire book really. And we get to see the scope of the world that Robert Jordan has created. And we begin to understand what the magic system is in this world. And one thing that I really like about this novel is that as large as the world is, it does feel intimate at times. We spend quality time with each of the characters, getting to know them and their relationships. Okay, on to the Sword of Truth. And its first novel was Wizard's First Rule. It was published in 1994, and interestingly enough, this was the author Terry Goodkind's first book. There are an astounding 21 books in this series, the last being published in 2020, and I don't even know if that's the final book in the season. If you do know, one way or the other, leave a comment below. Wizard's First Rule is a book that I've read 6 or 7 times, and when I picked this up the first time, there was not a second book in the series. And this is the actual copy that I purchased in 1997 to read. And while I did turn almost all the pages in my last reread a couple of weeks ago, I did listen to a portion of this on Audible. Unlike The Wheel of Time and Game of Thrones, there is no prologue in Wizard's First Rule. We just jump right into the action. Immediately we see that the world is smaller and there are less characters in this novel than in the Game of Thrones and Wheel of Time. I do really enjoy the almost opening scene where Richard sees Catelyn across the lake being chased by a quad and decides to go help her. There is almost no buildup and things start happening really fast, even before I feel like we get to know Richard. And honestly, throughout this entire book, I really had a hard time putting an age that I felt like Richard was, and even Catelyn. And I think without really time to get to know the characters and that development, I feel less invested in the characters in Sword of Truth than I do in Game of Thrones and Wheel of Time. The world building, I think, is smaller in Sword of Truth, Wizard's First Rule. The land is divided into 3 parts due to 2 boundaries. And maybe that's what makes it seem small and more constricted. But even when they get across the boundary, I still don't have a sense of this size, and it just feels way more compacted than in these 2 books. And I don't really get a sense of distance or time. And by time I mean age or history. There's no backstory, I don't feel like, in this novel. Like these, we have thousands of years of backstory, and that's all missing in Wizard's First Rule. What I do like about this is that something is always happening. It's a blockbuster book. There's always a trap, a danger, or some puzzle that Richard has to figure out. It's nonstop. And I'm not going to put this in high fantasy, more sword and sorcery. We have world-shaping events, but it's not as epic, not as high. We do have some typical components of magic. We have wizards, we have Catelyn, and she's a confessor. Her magic is that if she touches you and releases her power into you, you love her. To the exclusion of anything else. You would do anything for her. If she said to you, die, you would die. Though honestly, I'm just kind of underwhelmed by that power. Now, of course, we have the Sword of Truth, and that is given to the Seeker, and that happens to be Richard. And Richard also happens to be able to become a wizard. So that's fairly standard, if derivative. The twist on that is that in order to use the Sword of Truth, the intent is important. In fact, required. You have to have the intent to use it. Darken Rahl, he has the boxes of Orden, and he's going to open one of them. And one of them will kill him. One of them will give him unlimited power. And one of them will destroy the entire world. He thinks he knows which one to open, but he's seeking for the Book of Counted Shadows to verify his knowledge. And Richard has memorized and destroyed that book. Richard has been captured by Darken Rahl's hot dominatrix torture babes called Mord Sith. Denna is Richard's designated torturer or torturess. Zed, the first wizard, throws wizard fire at Richard. Kaylin touches Richard with her confessor power, and Richard uses the wizard's first rule to kill Darken Rahl. The only time of this book that really touched me was the end of Richard's time in captivity with the Mord Sith. And I don't say that because Denna was hot, but it was really the only time in the book that we spent a significant amount of time with some of the characters and we got to know them. And I think it was really well written. Okay, A Song of Ice and Fire, or Game of Thrones as most people know it from the TV show. George R. Martin released the first book, Game of Thrones, in 1996. He originally conceived of it as a trilogy, but it's still not done. Martin has so far published 5 of the now planned 7 volumes of A Song of Ice and Fire, and there are rumors right now, January 2024, that the 6th volume is coming out sometime soon. And I have read Game of Thrones 7 or 8 times. This here being my original 1997 copy. This was an astonishing story the first time through. And while it doesn't have the same impact now with the reread, I do really every time enjoy turning these pages. And I have read this as well on Kindle, and I did listen to a portion of it recently on Audible. The prologue begins north of the wall with some rangers hunting wildling. The rangers get owned by the White Walkers, except one who escapes to the south of the wall only to have his head removed from his neck by Ned Stark, the Lord of Winterfell. Winter is coming. This series I will slide into the epic low fantasy category. Epic because of the size of the world and the consequences of the actions of the characters affects everyone around them. Low fantasy because, unlike The Sword of Truth and Wheel of Time, magic is not one of the central themes, and none of the main movers make magic. Ned Stark, he leaves the North to go be the king's hand. The king doesn't know that his children really aren't. They are the result of an incestuous relationship between his queen and his brother-in-law. The king is killed, and in an ironic twist of fate, Ned has his head removed by the king's order, by his own sword. The new king being the dead king's son. I'm not really sure what Joffrey is. He's not a bastard. Perhaps he's a nephew or a stepson. Across the narrow sea, we have Daenerys, the silver-haired, soon-to-be mother of dragon. But for now, she's just the daughter of a king, killed by a king, killed by a boar, living in exile. And she is about to be wedded and bedded by the horse lord Khal Drogo. She is giving 3 petrified dragon eggs as a wedding gift. Westeros is thrown into unresolved chaos, a king on every corner. Khal Drogo falls off his horse. Daenerys suckles dragons. A Game of Thrones is great. I can remember my first read through still. I remember how I thought it was so different than any other fantasy I had ever read. It's gritty, dark, real, hard, just enough magic to be fantasy. Like, you read The Wheel of Time, which I love, but you know those Edmund Fields 5 are gonna still be alive at the end of this series. A Game of Thrones says, hold my beer. He kills Robert, Ned, Viserys, and Khal Drogo in the first book, among many others. The world is vast and the cast is huge. We see much of Westeros in the first volume and parts across the narrow sea. But there's much more to be discovered throughout the entire series and many more characters to be added to the series, so we can just kill them off. I like the pacing. we come to know the characters. And because of that, we grow to like, hate, or fear them. It's very well done. All right, let's go through my thoughts on these books. First of all, the specs and stats. These are all three massive books. Wheel of Time, 782 pages. Sword of Truth, 820 pages. Game of Thrones, 807 pages. Wheel of Time has the longest chapters, if that matters to you. Game of Thrones does a nice job with some shorter chapters, and each chapter is from a different character's perspective. I think it's really nice, and it's very paced really well. We definitely switch perspectives in the Sword of Truth less because there's less characters to switch between. Wheel of Time is relatively tame in both violence and sex. While mature themes are explored, especially deeper into this series, I would have no problem letting kids read this series and this book. It would be a heavy lift, but if a kid is an experienced reader, I think I would have no problem letting them read The Wheel of Time. Usually, like when a guy ogles a girl, it's usually her well-turned ankle that he's looking at. And most of the sword fights in this series are described using the names of the forms the swordsmen use. For example, the boar rushes downhill meets the oak shakes its branches. Later in the series, it does turn darker. Think Dumais Wells. Sword of Truth, no kids, especially as the series goes deeper. There's ogling, and it's not just of the ankles. And while there isn't graphic sex in this volume, it does exist. And the violence, quite a bit of it is just typical sword slashing, but there's mentions of disembowelments. Denna uses the agil. Think of a foot-long, thin leather pain rod on Richard, including some of his unmentionable parts. Kaelin cuts off a man's junk and, deservedly so, makes him eat it. Darken Rawl pours molten lead down a boy's throat. Okay, Game of Thrones, no kids, ever. We have sex throughout, and not always sexy sex. Underage sex, violent sex, and the violence. People get beheaded, as does a horse. Poison, swords and wars, even Arya gets into the fight with Needle. Game of Thrones, the violence is almost casual, as opposed to these, it's more forced. Game of Thrones, casual violence. Wheel of Time characters. By now, they are old friends of mine. I love returning to them, even those ones who annoy me. Kind of like a sister. You know who I'm talking about. They feel real and believable. It's a large cast and the names sometimes can be a challenge, but I think overall it's manageable. Sword of Truth characters, well, there's Richard and Kaelin. Owen said. I mean, of course there's others, but we don't spend enough time with them to care about them. Game of Thrones characters, it is a huge cast of characters, and it almost becomes unmanageable. It helps that so many of them get killed off, but he always seems to find more people to add to this story. There are characters in this book that you really like, and that you really hate, perhaps even more so than in The Wheel of Time. In the plot, Wheel of Time is just pure fantasy. I like how we get to explore the world, the idea, the whole concept. It's great. We have so much foreshadowing, things that don't have an explanation until so much later in the story. It feels cohesive and unfolds naturally. Sword of Truth, Wizard's First Rule. Okay, this was Mr. Goodkind's first book, and I feel like it shows. I feel like he just had a general idea and then started typing. While I do like the fast pacing of the book, it doesn't feel very balanced to me. Game of Thrones feels very tightly scripted. It doesn't have the magic to fall back on, so it relies on relationships, plots, intrigues, violence, and sex. Some of the good guys aren't so good, and you can't help but cheer for some of the villains. Okay, thoughts? Of these three novels, Game of Thrones is the best. And understand that I really did enjoy all three of these novels. And when I say it's the best, I mean about the style, the character, and the plots all excelling. My favorite read, however, is The Eye of the World. I can differentiate in myself between what I understand to be a technically superior novel to one that I just on the whole enjoy reading more. We have to consider the entire series now briefly. Wheel of Time, it's done. The series is complete. The Wheel of Time has turned and a new age has come to pass. Sword of Truth, I assume is done, but I really don't know. If you know, is he planning more books? Drop a comment below if you know if he is or if it's just completely done. I only read 11 books of this series, and there's a reason that I stopped reading them. It's been a long time since I turned the pages of those novels, but I just in my mind remember them being somewhat ridiculous. I just felt like Terry Goodkind was making shit up, which I know is what authors do, but I don't like to be reminded of that while I'm reading a book. Game of Thrones. Don't even get me started on George R.R. Martin. I was swearing up and down the other day that I'm never gonna give him another dime. It's taken him a whole decade. It's been a decade since he's brought out the last book of Song of Ice and Fire, and he still has 2 more to go. I swore I'm not gonna give him another dime, and I understand that's probably a lie. I'm probably gonna buy the next book when it comes out, but I'm gonna do so grudgingly. Of these 3 series, The Wheel of Time is the one that I'm most emotionally invested in. It chokes me up. There are certain parts of this series and this book that chokes me up every time that I read it. We're gonna sidebar a little bit. Years ago, I was in Colorado doing some training for work, and I went to a steakhouse across the street to have dinner, and I was staying at a Country Inn and Suites, and I borrowed, about 12 or 13 years ago, I borrowed Bridge to Terabithia. And I was just over there. I just seen the movie recently, or prior to that, and so I picked the book up and I took it over there and I was eating my steak and reading it. And I know how the book ends. And as I'm reading this, the kids, they're just loving each other and having such a gay old time. And I was just thinking about how it ended. And I'm at the steakhouse, I'm just crying and I'm weeping for sadness, knowing how the book ends. And the waitress came over and she's like, "Are you okay, sir?" I'm like, I'm fine, just go away. That's emotionally investment, and I was moved by the story, and The Wheel of Time is like that for me. When I'm reading just The Eye of the World, I know what happens 10 books down the road. And so when characters look at each other a certain way or say certain things to each other, the foreshadowing is so great, and my knowledge of what happens that it moves me. I'm not going to say to tears, but it does choke me up when I read The Wheel of Time. Love, love, love. Okay, with that, let's do a conclusion real quick, right? Should you read one of these series? Clearly, my recommendation is The Wheel of Time. Why? First of all, it's complete. It's coherent. It has fantastic world building, fantastic characters, and there's a whole mythology around it. I'm on a Facebook page. Screw you all. I love The Wheel of Time. I don't really post a lot on there. I don't have any Wheel of Time tattoos like some people do. But man, I have loved this story for a long time, and I'm going to continue to rereading this throughout my years. Game of Thrones? Well, how fast a reader are you? It's been a decade since the last books come out. So do you want to start a series that's not done yet? I mean, would I have started this, 15, 16 years ago if I knew it wasn't done? Well, probably. But it's so frustrating, and it makes me angry that these are such a fantastic work. Why can't he just finish it? It's just frustrating. Okay, Sword of Truth. Should you read that one? What a commitment, right? 21 books long. Now, I understand that these books, except one of the trilogies in here, they could all be considered a standalone book, though that seems kind of weird to me. I mean, if you read the first one, you're going to want to continue. And I remember the quality, I just kept thinking he's just making stuff up. Like, where's this coming from? There was no, I don't know. Can I recommend the Sword of Truth series? If you've read it and you're a big fan, let us know, and let us know why you really like it. And maybe the last 10 books that I haven't read really just brought everything home, but it's been a long time, and I just read this book again, and I really enjoy Wizard's First Rule, but I am not going to continue with this series. Okay, the TV series. Did you watch Game of Thrones? Wheel of Time is on Amazon right now. The second season just ended. Legend of the Seeker, it came out a while ago. It is purchasable on Amazon. Straight up, just don't watch Legend of the Seeker. We purchased it recently to watch some of the episodes intending for this video, and I just wasted 25 bucks of my time. That is just not worth any investment of your time at all. The Wheel of Time, okay, if you're a purist, this show infuriates you. You're raging inside. But what adaptation doesn't? Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, 50 Shades of Grey? They all get some things right and a lot of things wrong. Watch it if you want, just understand it's not the books. Game of Thrones? It's worth watching, of course. It is a fantastic series, despite the ending. Very well done and worth a go. And guys, those are all of my thoughts. Really, you can't go wrong with any one of these 3 books. If you've enjoyed the video, like it, subscribe to see more of my content. I do both whiskey and book reviews. And for now, my friends, I hope you're reading something good and drinking something great. Turn those pages and stay thirsty.